We have Jonathan Panikoff, now director at Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative, the Atlantic Council, and he joins us from Washington, D.C. Jonathan, it's good to have you on. Let's start with asking what's next. Israel is vowing, next moves against Iran, and it describes it as in a manner and time of our choosing. So how likely are those attacks from the Israeli side and possible for, diplomatic intervention by Joe Biden and G7 nations to come in time before those attacks?
Well, good morning and good to be with you. Look, obviously, President Biden has been very, very clear that the U.S. is not going to participate in an attack that Israel conducts and that it has no interest in seeing Israel conduct such an attack. The view by the U.S. right now is that the attacks by the Iranians were stopped almost completely, and so retaliation really isn't necessary. But I think at the end of the day, this goes to what has been a traditional Israeli policy, that if they're attacked, they're going to respond. They feel a need to respond. And so I think the question now is much more likely, what will the size and the scale be? Is it sufficient that it could just be a very small, precise attack on, say, a military complex in order to not trigger a broader war? That's what I think the U.S. is hoping for if they can't convince Israel to not attack at all.
Jonathan, I hear you about that point about, a retaliation being necessary by Israel, the way it sees it. But I do want to ask you about the point that Joe Biden's been making. This is a win for Israel because 99% of the drones and missiles launched were intercepted. Now, and I know this is a big if Israel sees it that way, what are the non-military options available to it?
Your point is very well taken. I think that's absolutely right. I think what I would distinguish is Israelis right now are seeing this as a success, not as a victory. In fact, I think there's been a lot of fear instilled, not just over the last 2 weeks in the lead up, but obviously from the strikes themselves, that is making Israelis and politicians in Israel feel like they have to be able to demonstrate something to come back from. If they can be convinced not to undertake a military action, then I still think you're probably looking at something in the clandestine realm. Cyber attacks, attacks against Iran's facilities that have been encouraging malign influence through the region from the IRGC. So I think if you're not going to do a direct military strike, you're looking at something in the clandestine world. But my guess is you're still more likely to see a military strike.
Okay, so if Israel does indeed take the military route, what are the most likely targets? I mean, are we talking about perhaps nuclear facilities here?
Well, certainly you've had some, including some in the U.S. on the hawkish right-wing side, call for that. My guess is you won't see that. In fact, that I think Israel knows would almost certainly spark massive retaliation and really create a war. My guess is what you're looking for from Israel is that they'll probably attack military sites, but a military site that's probably far out, that may not have major value. I think the issue is more about what the attack and response symbolizes for Israel, that it's not going to tolerate an attack on its soil more than actually wanting to cause a huge amount of destruction and damage. And so the question becomes, where does that end? If not a lot of damage is also done in Iran, is that going to be enough for the Iranians, or are they also going to respond? And then we get into a risk of an escalatory ladder of back and forth getting worse and worse, bigger and bigger.
Israel's attack on Iran's embassy earlier this year was this trigger for Iran's retaliation. But the two have, in fact, been engaged in a shadow war for years now. They've been attacking each other's assets without admitting responsibility. So why then has Iran chosen now to attack so openly? What is the message Iran is trying to send?
I think Iran is really seeking to restore deterrence. As you said, Israel has been doing some version of this for years. It's killed a number of scientists associated with the Iranian nuclear program. It's killed senior IRGC officials, like we saw in Syria almost 2 weeks ago, killing of Zahedi and 6 other officials. I think the Iranians were fed up and said, look, we have to put an end to this. We have to at least try to create some level of deterrence. For years, we've used our proxies. We don't want the proxies to trigger a bigger war. We need to do something that's actually bigger, that's not asymmetric or terrorist by attacking an Israeli embassy, say, in Southeast Asia. We really need to do something direct and try to demonstrate to Israel, we have these capabilities. We are going to use them if you don't stop doing this.
Jonathan, Joe Biden and Arab nations have been trying to avoid an escalation for some time now. I suppose with limited success, do they actually have any tools left, given that this takes it to a different level, this response from Iran?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think what they've been trying to prevent is obviously an escalation related to the Gaza conflict. I would argue that while obviously this is directly related, it's actually more corollary. This didn't happen because of Gaza. This was much more in line with what we were talking about in the last question, Israel's traditional maneuvers against IRGC, Iranian leadership and scientists, folks who could do long-term harm to Israel. And so I think Arab states will say, look, Jordan participated in helping with some of the defense. Saudi Arabia has had multiple calls, including with the U.S. Defense Secretary today. We can't afford in the region to have greater escalation. I'm skeptical that that message will get through to the Israelis in a way that would prevent them, but it may help, along with the U.S., to try to tone down Israeli action from being, say, a major retaliation to something much smaller, more precise, really geared to try to retaliate, but without making this a bigger conflict.
All right, many thanks for your insights this morning. Jonathan Panikoff there, Director at Scowcroft, a Middle East Security Initiative, the Atlantic Council.